Hello everybody, and you're very welcome to Academy House. My name's Kuhn Verbruggen. I'm the Director of Geological Survey Ireland, and we're one of the sponsors of this lecture series. Myself with Geological Survey Ireland, and Mary Cowan is here from Geological Survey Northern Ireland. Just have to do the housekeeping first. The aerostat bit. The fire exits are actually the back of the room and here, and hopefully we won't need them. So if fire alarm goes off, that's how you get out. This is the second of the public lectures in our sustainability series, which is challenges and opportunities for science and society. And like I said, it's been organised through two of the RIA committees, both the Geography and Geosciences Committee and then the Climate Change and Environmental Sciences Committee, supported by ourselves, GSI and GSNI. So the first lecture was back in February 22, online, the dreaded Zoom, by Professor Ian Stewart, who's now at the University of Jordan. And that was on selling planet Earth. And a video of that lecture is available on the RIA YouTube channel, as will this talk be. So this lecture tonight is being presented by Professor Jenny McElwain, who's the head of botany in Trinity College, and also the director of Trinity College Botanical Gardens. I know Jenny quite a while, and I've always been impressed by her, but I became a lot more impressed when I actually asked for her CV in order to present it. So as we only have an hour and a half, I won't read the entire CV. Suffice it to say, she's, an absolutely astoundingly successful lecturer and researcher in her area, but wears it very lightly. She's now in Trinity, where she moved in 2017, and she's helped set up the lab there that models paleo environments, which she'll talk about. Before that, she was at UCD for quite a long period, where she got involved in similar work, and even earlier before that at the Fields Institute in Chicago, and briefly in Sheffield. Her PhD is in paleobotany from Royal Holloway, and her original BA was from Trinity College. And she went to the Dominican College, which she still proudly includes in Wicklow. She proudly includes on her CV. So I'm really looking forward to it. As a geologist, we don't always have the kindest things to say about botanists, but I'll keep that for the Q&A. We'll have time for Q&A afterwards, and to query her about this. As I say, the lecture is being recorded. I would encourage social media, no problem, but please don't tweet the actual contents of the slides, because she's going to present some new and unpublished data which isn't out there yet. So if you don't mind doing that. So thank you very much. Jenny.
So thanks very much, Kuhn, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It looked very wet earlier on today, so it's really good to see you all. This evening I want to take you on a journey through geosciences in a way. So looking at past landscapes, past climates, and past atmospheric composition, to see can I kind of pull it all together at the end to say something about sustainability and where we're going in the future. And I have to say right from the start, I think my lecture is, it isn't necessarily providing an avenue of solutions for our future, but I hope you'll go away with knowing how important it is that we actually address climate change and that we move on a sustainable path. And I think geosciences has the power to reveal our future climate, because in a way our future climate is in our geological past. And geosciences can provide hard data and evidence in every realm of the Earth, in the oceans, on land, in the air, our climate, all aspects of the Earth system, which will reveal what is in store for us in the future if we don't go on a sustainable path. So could we turn the lights off? Would it be okay to turn the lights down a bit? The slides are very dark, I think. Can you see the slides, everyone okay? Yeah. Pardon? You need the lights, okay. So, well, hopefully you can see that okay. So there is a little dinosaur murky in the background there. So I'm going to start with past climates and past atmospheric composition. But I think I need to place us in the current to see what are some of our issues in terms of sustainability at the moment, which all of you, I'm sure, are very aware of. So I took this from the Department of Taoiseach, and it basically is presenting Ireland's climate action plan. And I wanted to highlight two parts, because I can't actually read it from over there. So the climate action plan has the ambition of reducing greenhouse gases by 51% by the year 2030. And that sounds like the distant past. That's just 8 years away. And it has the ambition of Ireland, we have the ambition of bringing our greenhouse gas concentration down to net zero by 2050. And that's only 28 years away. So why do we want to do this? And it's because science shows us that there's going to be devastating consequences of climate change if we don't do it. But you see a document like this, and it's presented, but behind this are decades of science which got us to this point, providing the evidence base for the policy. And in a way, scientists have been arguing and shouting for decades. And now I feel very hopeful that things are actually happening. So what I want to do today is basically show you some of the data that goes into this policy framework. Why do we have to reduce our greenhouse emissions? What is in store if we don't? And I think to answer why we have to do that, we have to know where we came from, and we have to get a baseline. What is the baseline in the geological past? What is normal? How can we say today isn't normal? And then I also want to touch on what are some of the consequences that we see in the fossil record, using fossil plants, which is my area, through different intervals in Earth history. Oh, it's really difficult to see, but the numbers aren't so important. It's the structure. So this chart here, it shows you our current situation. So here we have atmospheric CO2. Is there a pointer? I didn't ask for a pointer. Yeah, I can't seem to use it. Oh, there's the mouse. It's okay, I've got it, the mouse. So atmospheric CO2 today is 411 parts per million. And if we go back to the atmospheric composition in 1850, you can see it was substantially lower than today. So how did we get there? Well, in order to understand how we got there, we can look at the sources and sinks of carbon. So the main sources are obviously coal and oil and gas. And if you think of these in terms of this was carbon that was laid down over millions and tens of millions of years in the geological past. Through natural cycles, it would be released back into the atmosphere, but that would usually happen over tens of millions of years. And the issue is that we've taken, a good 100 million years of carbon storage, and we've released it in 100 years. So even though Earth is said to be a Goldilocks planet, where the temperature of the Earth has been maintained in this habitable zone, not too cold, not too hot, if you put that amount of carbon into the atmosphere, you're going to cause a disturbance and a disequilibrium. So on the other side, I think we always focus on the sources of carbon. On the right-hand side, on your right-hand side, we've also got the sinks. So a third of the carbon that we've emitted over the last 100 years has been taken up by land, and these are called land sinks. It's been sequestered. And about a third has been taken up by the oceans. So our future, what we have to do is cut down those sources, fossil fuel and land use change, but we also have to try and increase those sinks. And then we're working, Ireland is working under a national policy framework which comes under the umbrella of the Paris Climate Agreement. So the Paris Climate Agreement has the ambition of maintaining the Earth's global temperature rise below 2 degrees. And with an even more ambitious target of maintaining Earth's global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And you kind of think, well, where did these come from? I mean, these seem so arbitrary. who picked 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees? And the reason we have these particular global temperature targets is because it's considered that there are thresholds in the climate system, maybe also in the biological system, but that's much more difficult to look at, if you go above these temperature changes. And really one of the most powerful ways of looking at, well, what will happen if we go above 2-degree global warming or a 1.5-degree global warming, is to look back in the geological record. So this is data from McElwain, but it's the published record of climate change in Ireland over the last 100 years. So you can see that, and it's showing at trends, an anomaly trend compared to the long-term average. So you can see we're moving into red over the past few decades. Ireland has warmed by 0.9 degrees centigrade over the last 100 years. So that is in line with the global temperature trends of about 1.1 degrees centigrade. And I suppose the question is, what is in store for our climate futures? And if we look at one of the most recent climate reports, the IPCC, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, number 6 report. This is a really nice way of presenting the data. It's presenting it in terms of climate stripes. So blue are cool, red is warm. And what you're seeing in this graph, which is a bit difficult because, let's see, can I get my pointer? But you're moving from left to right, from blues, cool in the historical period up to 1850. That's from proxy data, so that's from subfossil material. And then 1850 to the present day, it's actual instrumental records. And there's no doubt we can see that globally the Earth is warming. And then the 5 bars on the right, they're looking at our potential climate futures under different scenarios. So the lowest one is looking at a kind of a sustainable future. And obviously it's less red. We have a less warmer world. And the top bar is the most unsustainable future. And those SSPs, they just mean socio-economic pathways. And I suppose our ambition globally is to go on one of these low pathways. But the only way we can do that, in actual fact, is that a pointer? Yeah, thanks. The only way we can do that, thanks, Sheila, is if we, yeah, that's great. We have to take action now. We can't wait. It's kind of like the COVID curve. The longer you wait, the steeper the action is you have to take. If you're immediate with action in terms of curbing greenhouse gases, then the carbon cycle will draw down CO2. So for the rest of the lecture, what I want to do is look into the past. And I want to show you from my own research how I reconstruct carbon dioxide levels through Earth history using fossil plants. And we're also going to look at a few time points in Ireland to see what Ireland looked like under a warmer global climate, something that is predicted for our future under these different scenarios. So I work with fossil plants. I typically work with fossil plants usually from Greenland. You never look in your own neighborhood. But I also have worked with some Irish fossils, which I'll talk about today. And I use fossil plants because they're intimately linked with climate. They're immobile, plants are. They have to be adapted to the climate. So we can understand how to read those signals. So we can use fossil plants to reconstruct past climates and past atmospheric composition. And these are some beautiful fossils from Greenland, the fiddlehead of a fern. This is a beautiful ginkgo relative opening up like the leaves of a book. I also work with fossils that are chemically almost unaltered compared to modern plants. So this is a tiny little seed fern that is peeling off the rock. You can see a glimpse of its veins on the rock surface there. So fossil plants are absolutely remarkable. Some are completely replaced by inorganic molecules, so we can't use their chemistry to say anything about past climates and atmospheres, but some are unaltered, and this illustrates it. So this dark thing down here is a fossil ginkgo, and that is a modern ginkgo leaf. And these are the chemical analysis, absorbance spectra. And you can see that they're almost identical. So the fossil, even though it's 70 million years old, has these carbon-hydrogen bonds, the carbon-oxygen bonds, just as the modern. So a lot of the fossils I work with are pristine chemically, and we can look at their isotopic composition, and that is a great signal for looking at atmospheric composition in the past. So I typically have worked up and down the geological column, so from anywhere between 400 million years ago and the present day, from early Devonian all the way up to about Oligocene, 20, 30 million years ago, 30 million years ago. So here's some more spectacular fossils. This is a fossil, just to illustrate, of ginkgo peeling off the rock. And you can actually use a fluorescent light to top light it, and you can see the surface of the fossil in microscopic detail. So here we're seeing stomata, the breathing pores on the leaf surface, and lots of little microsurface roughness on the surface of the fossil. Fossils also, if you're lucky, preserve biology in action. And these are examples of permineralized fossil from a very famous locality called Rhynie Chert. And here we have, these have been fossilized by being inundated by mineral-rich waters in volcanic springs. So here we have a male reproductive structure of an early land plant releasing sperm. So this is biology in action, reproduction in action. And here is a spore which is germinating. Sometimes you can also find molecular signatures or hints on the genome. So although DNA isn't well preserved in fossils beyond about tens of thousands of years, this is a spectacular fossil, and this was published by a group in Sweden, and it's a cross-section of the stem of a royal fern. And it has exquisite preservation that allows you to look at the nucleus inside a cell. So this is a cell, and that is a nucleus. And this was it's Jurassic, it's about 180 million years old. It was the first fossil nucleus preserved in the geological record. And the nuclear size, if you've got the size of the nucleus, you can estimate the chromosome number. So you can actually estimate the genome size of this fossil. And here is its living relative, Osmunda regalis, and you can see that the nucleus is almost identical. So there's an example of evolutionary stasis in the fossil record where genome size has been unchanged over millions of years. What else can you do with fossil plants? Well, sometimes fossil leaves and fossil material is damaged, and the damage we know is happening when the plants were alive, because you see wound response. And by studying this feeding behavior of herbivores, you can actually use fossil leaves indirectly to study animals, what were eating these ancient things. And often insect feeding has very specific feeding traces. So in some cases, the origin of different insect groups, the evidence comes from their feeding behavior on a fossil leaf in the absence of their body fossil being found. But I work on, I suppose, fossils which don't look so spectacular to the eye until you get them under the microscope. So this little fossil here is a conifer leaf. It's absolutely tiny. It's a scale leaf collected from the Jurassic of Yorkshire. And on the leaf surface, there are lots of glowing, fluorescing pores. So I use changes in the number of stomata on the leaf surface to reconstruct CO2 in the atmosphere in the geological past. And how do I do that? Well, there's a very simple relationship. So all leaves produce stomata of varying size and number. And CO2 concentration in the atmosphere controls the development of stomata, and it's an optimization relationship. When there's lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, plants develop fewer stomata. They get the same carbon gain, but the benefit to the plant is they lose less water. So a simple optimization principle. And if we can calibrate this relationship, which is what I do, you have a way, a very simple way, by looking at fossil stomata in fossil plants, you can reconstruct the atmospheric conditions in which those plants lived and developed, which is pretty amazing. Very simply put, under high atmospheric times of the past, high CO2 levels, we get few stomata on the leaf surface. You can see them there. And when carbon dioxide levels were low, you get many stomata on the leaf surface. And a lot of the research I've done over the past few decades has been working out how we can calibrate that. So I present it there very simply in a cartoon. But there's, believe me, a lot of work has gone into trying to actually quantify it. And there are 3 families of methods. So the most simple is basically looking at changes in numbers of stomata. And a little bit more complex is looking at the chemistry, looking at the carbon isotopic composition. But both of those methods, you need to calibrate them with a known CO2 change. And then the most recent method is called a mechanistic model. So this takes a kind of a modern understanding of plant physiology, modeled mechanistically, and the inputs are stomatal density, carbon isotopic composition, and understanding modern plant physiology. It comes up with the CO2 estimate. So how do we calibrate these methods? Well, if you're a natural historian, we have these, we're terrible and wonderful collectors as humans. So we've collected hundreds of years of dried plant specimens. And we know from places like Mauna Loa in Hawaii and also the, I can't remember the name of the station, but on the west coast of Ireland, we have continuous records of CO2 over the last century. So we know the age of these dried plant specimens. We can calibrate how those stomata respond over known changes in CO2 through time. So that's one way you can calibrate. And you kind of get data sets like this. So this is for ginkgo, showing a decrease in stomatal density with CO2 increasing. You can also calibrate in experimental facilities. So this is the new lab we've set up in Trinity that Koen was talking about. This is called the Variable Atmosphere and Light Lab. And in UCD, I set up a lab called the Program for Experimental Atmospheres and Climate, the PAEC lab. But essentially what both these labs do, there's a person for scale, Camilla. They're huge walk-in climate-controlled growth chambers where you can control all aspects of climate: day length, light intensity, light spectrum, CO2 concentration. And the new lab has these wonderful LED lights. So before we could only control intensity, now we can actually do not full solar spectrum, but from UVA all the way to near infrared light experiments. So this is what we've done a lot in the research. We have grown plants which are living relatives of ancient fossils. We've grown them in simulated Mesozoic, like ancient dinosaur time atmospheres, and calibrated the response of the plants growing in these conditions. And then that gives us a calibration data set to then look at a fossil, extract its chemistry, its isotopic composition, or the stomatal numbers, and estimate CO2 in the past. And there's always a worry with calibration data sets. You have to make a uniformitarian principle. You have to make the assumption that what you observe in your calibration data set will also hold through geological time. It's much better if you have a mechanistic understanding behind that data set. And I think there was a beautiful study done by a PhD student, to all those PhD students out there. She published her first paper in Nature, Janice Lake in Sheffield. And she did this really beautiful experiment where she grew little Arabidopsis plants. She built these little mini CO2 chambers for the mature leaves. So she exposed the old leaves to elevated CO2, double the current level. And she let the new leaves grow outside the little mini high CO2 chambers. So the new leaves were growing in, at the time, 360. That sounds like so long ago. That was actually only in 2000, the year 2000. We're now at 417. And she observed these leaves when they were fully developed, and they had much fewer stomata than you would expect, growing at 360 ppm. So what this really elegant experiment showed is that the mature leaves are sensing the atmosphere, and they're signaling to the newly developing leaves the optimum number of stomata to exchange their gas. And we've since worked out, other biologists have worked out that the sensing molecule is carbonic anhydrase. It's present in stomata, and we have it on our tongue. So we sense fizzy drinks. You can taste a fizzy drink. What you're tasting is CO2. So plants in their stomata taste the CO2 in the atmosphere. And through a developmental program, they optimize the number. So for the paleobotanist, we were obviously in awe, but also delighted by this experiment because it provided a functional basis for our data sets. We could understand why we saw what we did. So after that big introduction, I am showing you, this is a reconstructed record of carbon dioxide change over 400 million years of Earth history based on fossil stomata. And the scale here is 2,000 ppm. So for modern, just to orientate you, modern is 417 parts per million. And I've put this record up here with 47 independent research papers that have contributed to this curve. So what we see in the record is that early in the Devonian, when plants and animals were making the transition to land, going from water world to a land-based world, or life on land, carbon dioxide levels were very high, 2,000 parts per million. And they dropped down into the great Carboniferous glaciation, the late Pennsylvanian. So this is when we have coal swamps all over America, Ukraine, the UK. And those coal swamps sequestered the carbon from the high atmospheres. But this sequestration, this is 100 million years of time to bring that atmosphere down to something like modern. And then as you go into the Mesozoic, you have high carbon dioxide levels. This is a greenhouse world, ice-free. There's no ice at the poles. And you can see it's bumpy. If we go from the last 65 million years, which really it was the Cenozoic, it's the formation of our living flora and fauna and the human line, CO2 has been coming down. So juxtaposed here, I have some of the future projections based on different socioeconomic scenarios. And it doesn't matter the detail, but what you see is this is the sustainable path, future. But we're not on that path currently. That's the path we want to be on. All of these other futures up to the year 2300, they are in our geological past and not so long ago. So this huge amount of work from labs all over the world, my lab has contributed all these studies to this CO2 curve. And part of the research that my lab does and my colleagues around the world who work with this stomatal-based proxy, you can see there's lots of noise. It's imperfect. And what we're trying to do collectively now is to reduce down the noise. And we're developing kind of community projects, which are kind of rejecting some records from the total curve and accepting others and building up the criteria so that we can reduce the noise and really get a good handle on how CO2 has changed through time. When you know this, you can ask questions like, when, in our current CO2 concentration, when was it last as high as it is today? And actually, there was a BBC podcast on this, and every scientist they asked gave a different answer. And that shows that answering that question is actually very difficult, and it's active research. So based on this record, we would say that the last time the Earth had a sustained CO2 level similar to today was 25 million years ago. And that was published in 2017, and I would actually think we can update this now. And then you can also ask future atmospheric CO2 concentrations by the end of this century, if you go on either of these future socioeconomic paths, kind of middle sustainable. But they're going to be, our future, literally by the end of this century, we will not have experienced such high CO2 levels since 40 to 50 million years ago. So a lot of the work that we are doing now in the paleobotany community and other people who work on proxies is trying to really rigorously answer that question and really nail it down. So this is a group, a Paleo CO2. They have a website, and this is a community of proxy people who are working on CO2 reconstructions using many different methods. So the method I use is stomatal frequency, leaf gas exchange, C3 plants. But there's marine paleontologists who are using phytoplankton. They're looking at carbon isotopes. They're looking at boron proxies to get at pH, and then from pH to get at CO2. And there's lots of paleosols. They're looking at CO2 concentration in a fossil soil and then working out what does that mean about the ancient soil. And we're focusing on the last 65 million years initially. And you can see over the last 65 million years, this is ocean curve, very famous, SACOS data set. There's been a long-term cooling. And we want to really, you can see this is a mess at the moment. So I'm not showing you what we've got. I'm showing you the mess before the piece of work that we'll publish soon on the CO2 record for the last 65 million years. But what I can say, and this is unpublished and I think really exciting, is that this new CO2 record, we asked, when was CO2 concentration as high as it is today? And we did this, as in Gabe Bowen and Barbel Honish in the US. They modeled it, and here is the probability. So it shows that about 14.5 million years ago was the last time CO2 concentration was as high as it is today on a sustained basis. So between 14 million years and about 23 million years, you can see CO2 is higher than today, and the statistics support that. So let's look at that. What did it look like? What did the world look like between that interval? Now, I know this is a horrible, noisy slide, so I'm going to walk you through it. Here, this interval is known as the mid-Miocene climate optimum. And in all geological records, it's really unusual. So if you look in marine records, you see lots of organic burial. It's called the Monterey event. So the oceans are responding by burying huge amounts of carbon. If you look at the volcanic record, there is basalt activity. The CO2 was about similar to today. If you look at human evolution, so we're on the primate line, but the first hominids had not occurred. The first hominins, here's the first humans. So what we can say with this new result is that at no time in the evolution of the human line has CO2 been as high as it is today. I think that's absolutely terrifying. And something else that this record shows, if you look at, this is the oxygen 18 record, so it's a proxy temperature record for the ocean. And it doesn't matter about the values, but look at the noise. So in this interval, the amplitude of variability is really high. And when you go from the red bar into the later Eocene, you can see that the amplitude of climate variability gets smaller. So what this data set shows is that under a high CO2 greenhouse world, you get a much larger amplitude of climate variability. Whereas when you under a lower CO2, lower than it has been for like the normal CO2 during the whole of human evolution, you get a more stable climate and less variability. So we hear the IPCC, we read the summary report, and it says, our future climate is going to be more variable, and it just kind of washes over, you know. It's only when you begin to see it and feel it on the ground that you think, okay, yes, these scientists are correct. But here you have it in the Geoscience record showing a high greenhouse world, you're going to have more climate variability. And for the last 14 million years, we've been in relatively stable climate conditions, except the glacial interglacial ice ages. But we haven't been in a greenhouse world for the last 14 million years. So what I want to do now is look at, well, what did Ireland look like based on the fossil data over these greenhouse intervals of the past? And I think this is a really interesting thing to do, especially for any biologists in the room, because it kind of makes you think, well, what is native? We obviously have a biodiversity crisis as well. And we always want to preserve the native. But as a geoscientist and a paleobotanist, you know, where do you put the time bracket to say what is native? Because what you'll see is that we had many exotic species in our geological past. So I've got one of these dreaded CO2 curves again, and this time it's a log scale. So the last 50 million years to 1 million year, we went from a high greenhouse world to lower CO2, went through the glacial interglacial cycle, modern, and this is our future. So it really is stark when you see this. And I want to look at these different sites in Ireland, which have really nice fossil evidence for what Ireland looked like. So we're going to start with the Antrim basalts. So the interbasaltic layers sometimes preserve organic material and often preserve fossils. And even though these haven't been studied paleobotanically for a long time, some of the original monographs from this work, there's Ireland up there, you find huge evergreen leaves. And large leaves is an indicator of warm, wet climates. We could actually do a lot more science on this and actually estimate the mean annual temperature. I think we should do that. But what are some of these species? Well, we know we have magnolia. And for any of you who are gardeners, magnolia will grow in Ireland, but it's not a native today. So this is a definitely warmer, wetter Ireland. And this was about 60 million years ago. So now jumping right forward to Oligocene sediments in Lough Neagh. And there are many deposits of published fossil pollen, and some of the pollen, and actually I know the specimens, actual macrofossil specimens in the Natural History Museum. We find fossil pollens of Taxodium, the bull cypress. So today, Taxodium, you find it in Georgia, the southern states of America, southern Illinois, Georgia, North Carolina. And there's also a questionable Taceae, that's tea. So that is tea, does not grow in Yorkshire. It doesn't grow in Ireland either. So this is a much warmer world, and actually the Taxodium swamp, so this is showing that we have a lot of wetlands across the Irish landscape, and this is the case for the whole of Europe. Wetlands with a mix of these Taxodium and broad-leafed evergreen trees, which aren't so abundant across the European landscape today. And then moving another step forward, this is work of Pete Coxon. And this is looking at a site in Connemara, which is dated to Pliocene in age, so somewhere between 2.5 and 5.3 million years. And this is a picture of how Pete Coxon reconstructed the landscape based on the pollen. So what you're looking at here is West Coast, Washington, West Coast, North America. So you've got a temperate rainforest with much warmer taxa that we see today. And even though we have remnants of temperate rainforest in Kerry and the west coast of Ireland today, we don't have some of the warm temperate elements that you find in the Pliocene. So what is he finding? I'm going to go to the actual pictures. So he finds pollen of sequoia, so that is coast redwood, which is a fire-adapted plant. If you press on the trunk of a sequoia, it's big, spongy, thick red bark. That's fire adapted. And that's usually that would be, most likely you'd have much more fire than present. And that is predicted for a future under a globally warmer world. You have a genus called Simplicos, which today is almost exclusively lower latitudes, so tropical, subtropical latitudes, extending a little bit into Europe, but I think those records are actually probably gardens, but this is the native range. And then you get things like carrier. This is pecan. So we had pecan nuts and bald cypress and coast redwood in the Irish flora of the past. So what we can also do with, when you've got a good record of CO2 or climate and atmospheric change in the past, is you can look at processes. So if you can understand an Earth system process in the past, you can run models to test those models in the past and better understand processes which may play out in the future. And the kind of processes I'm thinking of are feedback effects. So climate change is warming because of high CO2. What are some of the feedback effects that could make it even warmer that we haven't anticipated? Maybe clouds are going to change. This is a prediction that will make it warm. It'll change the radiator budget. That's a big unknown. So I just have a few slides for this. So this is a model of what would happen if you emplace a giant, large igneous province on the Earth's surface, like the Deccan Traps. So this contributed to the extinction of dinosaurs. And the model is asking, if you inject a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, how long would it take, with no intervention, for the Earth to sequester that carbon? And what the model predicts, it's an Earth system model by Dupré, it shows that it will take 1 million years. So this is why Earth is a Goldilocks planet. We've never had a runaway greenhouse. So CO2 has never gone above a level where life can't exist, and we've never had an ice planet, totally frozen over. So a CO2 so low that the whole planet freezes. And this is because when you increase CO2, you increase temperature. So you enable temperature-driven processes like weathering. So you accelerate weathering. Weathering accelerates. That draws down carbon into the ocean, and ultimately you balance the atmosphere. But it takes 1 million years. So this is a model. A lot of the work I've done over the past few decades has actually been, in a way, testing this model with actual data. So here, don't worry about the detail, but what I want you to see is this familiar spike. So this is a CO2 record for conifers and ginkgos and global mean temperature change here. So this is a 6-degree global warming from the Toarcium, which is in the Jurassic. And what it shows is there's a huge injection of CO2 into the atmosphere, and then processes kicked in and the CO2 came back to a steady state. In this case, it took about 200, 300,000 years. And what were the processes that sequestered all that carbon? Well, this dark gray line indicates ocean accumulation of organic carbon, and it's called an oceanic anoxic event. So the oceans took up all the carbon, but the consequence is you get dead zones and extinction, because when you take up so much carbon so quickly, you deoxygenate parts of the ocean. So one of the predictions for our future is that we're going to affect oxygen concentration. I've seen that familiar spike in the Cretaceous. So here we have a spike of CO2 going up, and then it takes, well, we've got really good time calibration, but on the order of hundreds of thousands of years to bring it back to a steady state. And here are the fossils we're working on. They're Lauraceae fossils. You can see the beautiful stomata here. So one thing that has always intrigued me is that when you look at these records, so here's our past, and this is our future, they always stop at the year 2100. But, you know, the Earth isn't going to stop then. So if you take this learning from geology, if you take the data and the models and ask the question, if we go on this path, or if we go on this path, how long would it take the Earth to sequester that carbon and bring the Earth back to a steady state if we have no intervention. And it's very depressing. So, I'm sorry. I'll try and lighten it up at the end. But so on our most sustainable path, here we are today. We're actually above this now. We're at 417 ppm. So the most sustainable path is the blue path. We go up to 500 ppm, and it takes about 30,000 years for the carbon cycle to come back to steady state. So it's like the COVID curve. We know these curves. We've seen them. If you vaccinate everyone now, this is the death curve. If you wait, this is the death curve. So this is the most unsustainable pathway. We just go to 2,000 ppm CO2. We won't do that. We won't do that. But if we left it that long and we overshot our Paris Climate Agreement, it would take over 300,000 years to come back to a steady state. So what I think, I was asked to speak about how geology could inform sustainability. I think what we can do with the geological record is just stress. We have to act now. We have to act soon. We have to go on those sustainable pathways. Even if we don't understand thresholds or know where those thresholds are, just being precautionary. Why would we want to go that pathway when it's going to take so long to come back to a steady state? Earth will be fine. Something new will evolve, but only given 300,000 years, not in 100 years or 200 years. So I suppose to conclude, we have to cut down these sources. We know what to do. We just stop burning fossil fuels. We have to go on a green, carbon neutral pathway. And we have to really invest for biodiversity and climate in land use so that we can increase these land and ocean sinks, healthy land, healthy ocean, UN Sustainable Development Goals. There is some hope. This is a data set from the Carbon Project, which is a wonderful group. And here's increasing CO2. What's really interesting is that sinks, like forests and carbon being taken up by land, they are also increasing. And the strength of the ocean sink is also increasing. So even though we are really wrecking the atmosphere and the climate, thank goodness that these sinks are also increasing. But what we need to do now is ask, how much longer can they keep taking up carbon? And you can actually use the fossil record to try and address that. So I'm going to leave you with a positive point. So these are fossils, and you can't really see them too well, but they're from a really famous fossils called Archaeopteryx. These are late Devonian in age. It has the trunk of a conifer and the branches and leaves of a fern, and it reproduces like a fern. So a completely weird, extinct group. But we have an incredible array of fossils in Ireland, in the Natural History Museum, in Trinity, in UCD, in Cork, that they're all over, in every university, these wonderful fossils. So I had a student who used the fossils and looked at the branch length, the allometry, the architecture, the leaf size to try and model how much biomass did that giant weird plant in the Devonian take up. And she used a very simple model to get at the amount of biomass. And here it is, Archaeopteryx. This is her model. And here it is in time. So it occurred in a greenhouse time in Earth history. And this is our estimate. So based on using a modern model which takes into account the architecture and makes some assumption about the amount of carbon. Typically, a tree is 50% carbon. We've made that assumption for the past. And then you looked at the size and how big these things got. And we estimate that Archaeopteryx took up between 570 and 689 tons of carbon per hectare. And because this is the first time I'd done this, well, that was just totally abstract. It just meant nothing to me. So I thought, okay, let's look at what plants we know do. So we looked at temperate oceanic coniferous forests. So think about Ireland in the Pliocene, like Washington. They take up between 150 and 250 tons of carbon per hectare. So I thought, okay, we've done something really wrong. Then we looked at, okay, let's go for our beautiful, wonderful, not Sitka spruce forests in Ireland. Picea sitgensis, 87 to 190 tons carbon per hectare. So it was like, oh my God, we have really done something wrong. We've got it, we'll have to go back to the books. But my wonderful student searched the literature, and she found this fabulous plant, which I know, Agathis australis. So anyone who's been to New Zealand and has seen the beautiful kauri pine, they take up between 364 and 672 tons of carbon per hectare. And that is a trunk of a tree. For scale beside this, they're similar. We can't see the top of that tree, and that's a person. So this is 2 meters in diameter, that base. So when I saw this, I thought, okay, there's potential. There's potential in biology to be a greater carbon sink than we currently realize. And maybe we're looking at the wrong species here, but there's definite potential work for Ireland to take up more carbon and globally. So to conclude, you won't be able to read it, but what I've shown here is that there's a volcano. And I put it up because we know from Geosciences that we know based on the numbers that multiple volcanic episodes in the geological past released an equivalent amount of CO2 into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years that we've released in 100 years. So I've said it, like humans are a volcanic force. Lots of people have said it. We actually have the numbers to show that we are. We are actually geology. So we have these things in geology called large igneous provinces. We are a large igneous province. Yeah, we absolutely are. And what geosciences can do, I can't even read my slides, but what it can do is it reveals how the carbon cycle works in geological time. It reveals that the CO2 has never been as high as it is today in the past 15 million years. But it also, I think, in terms of sustainability, I haven't shown you solutions. Today I've just said, I have to reinforce this message. Geoscience shows you why we have to go on a sustainable path now and not wait. Because we can use our understanding of Earth system processes to show what are those terrible consequences that are on the Taoiseach's page in that paragraph, which fronts the Climate Action Plan for Ireland. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, man.